late at night in a small neighborhood of the city. Mike's auto repair shop, old but reliable, was immersed in silence. Mike had just finished the last repair and was about to leave when the sound of an engine reached his ears from afar. His heart stopped. A black car had appeared in the parking lot, and three men with hard gazes stepped out. They were walking toward the gates, bringing a threat with them. Mike knew who they were: the local extortion gang. They had been demanding money from him for protection for a long time, and Mike was tired of paying. He met their gaze and said resolutely, "I won't pay any more." The air around seemed to freeze. Something had broken. Mike felt that today would be different. The dim light of the workshop cast shadows over everything, with only a lamp above the workbench giving off a faint light onto the scattered tools. Jason stood in the shadows, hearing every rustle from outside. His eyes focused on the group of men slowly approaching the gates. A cold resolve lived in his heart. He knew this wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of a trial, where the stakes were the life of his friend and the future of their business. As the gangsters were almost at the gates, Jason stepped out of the shadows, his gaze frozen the air around him. "Listen carefully." His voice was deep and calm, but sounded like a warning. "Mike is tired of paying for protection. He's paid too much and he won't pay any more. Leave now before I do something you'll regret." The shadows on the faces of the intruders twisted with anger, but there was a hint of respect in their eyes. They knew who they were dealing with. One of the gangsters, a tall guy with tattoos on his arms, smirked and said, "You think we'll just leave like that? You're nobody. We'll be back and then you won't have a chance." Jason didn't blink, just stepped forward even closer, never looking away. "You don't know who you're messing with. You don't know what real fighting is. Make your choice, leave or stay, and find out what I'm capable of." Suddenly, one of the gangsters swung and slammed his fist into the workbench. Tools flew in all directions, and the crash shattered the air. Mike, standing in the doorway, felt the anxiety freeze in his chest. His hands trembled, but his eyes were full of resolve. He knew Jason wouldn't let them break everything. Jason slowly pulled a wrench from his pocket. A simple tool, but in his hands it turned into a weapon. "I warned you," he said quietly, yet with an iron certainty. "Now the choice is yours." The gangsters exchanged glances, the tension in the air becoming palpable, as if anticipating the storm about to hit. The workshop's dim lighting barely illuminated the space, with only one lamp above the workbench casting a yellowish glow, making everything around seem almost otherworldly. Jason stood in the center of the room, like a calm storm, ready to unleash at any moment. His hands gripped the wrench firmly, simple but heavy and solid, a tool perfectly suited for defense. His eyes, cold and focused, never left the figure of the tall gangster who was slowly approaching. Inside Jason, a storm of emotions raged, a mix of exhaustion, fury, and resolve. He thought of Mike, of how this small auto repair shop wasn't just his friend's work, but their shared life, a hope for a better future. And he wouldn't let that hope die. Mike stood slightly to the side, across from the workshop entrance, his breath uneven, his hands slightly trembling with tension. His gaze flickered between Jason and the gangsters, and at that moment he felt that everything would be decided right here and now. He remembered the years of hard work, how he had built his business, how every night after his shift he sat at this workbench, dreaming of peace. Now it could all collapse in an instant. But when he saw Jason, calm and confident, a spark of hope awoke in his soul. The tall gangster took a confident step forward. His face was twisted in disdain and threat. He held a knife, a thin blade that gleamed in the dim light. "You think one wrench is all you've got?" he grumbled, getting closer. Jason didn't look away. He understood that every fraction of a second mattered now. His body was ready to move, every muscle tense, his breathing steady. In an instant, Jason made a sharp strike. His movements were lightning fast, like a dance honed by years of training. The wrench flew in an arc, striking precisely and powerfully into the hand of the attacker. The sound of the strike echoed through the workshop, and the knife flew from the gangster's fingers, clattering to the floor with a metallic ring. The gangster's expression changed. Now there was pain and surprise in his eyes. He recoiled, losing the initiative. The other gangsters, seeing how quickly and precisely Jason acted, rushed forward. But Jason was no longer alone. His movements were synchronized, precise, every step reflecting experience and cold-blooded control. He dodged blows, parried attacks, and delivered strikes of his own. The wrench swapped for fists, and the fists for deft, hand-to-hand combat techniques. In that moment, the workshop turned into an arena where not only the fate of the business was at stake, but their very lives. Mike stood frozen. His heart pounded so loudly it seemed it would drown out everything around him. He felt fear, but also an overwhelming pride for his friend, who stood by his side. With every second of the fight, Mike realized they weren't just defending the walls of the workshop. They were defending their dreams and their freedom. His gaze caught every moment, and inside a feeling grew that right now they were fighting for everything that mattered to them. At one point, one of the gangsters tried to grab Jason from behind to knock him off balance. But Jason, like a cat, instantly sensed the approaching danger and spun around in one swift motion. He delivered a quick elbow strike to the attacker's face and, with a couple of precise moves, disarmed him. The gangster collapsed to the floor, and the remaining ones momentarily hesitated. Fear appeared in their eyes. In this lightning-fast scuffle, Jason felt an invisible weight, the weight of responsibility for his friend's life, for what they had built together. Each strike was not only filled with force, but with meaning. He wasn't just hitting, he was defending hope. He knew this first strike was only the beginning, and ahead new trials awaited them. As soon as the last of the gangsters retreated from the workshop, the silence in the air became almost tangible. But Jason didn't allow himself to relax. He saw how three of them quickly disappeared into the darkness of the streets, as if shadows melted into the night. His gaze didn't leave their silhouettes, fading into the narrow alleys and deserted courtyards. His heart raced. He knew they couldn't be let go. This was only the first round. Without a word, Jason rushed after them. Mike wanted to stop his friend, but he knew he couldn't. "Be careful," Mike shouted, but Jason had already dived into the dark alley, where the echo of the pursued footsteps filled the air. Every movement of Jason's was precise and calculated, his muscles remembering hundreds of such night chases. He understood that he could lose them on narrow forks or around corners, so he kept them in his sight, not allowing them to escape. The night seemed alive, creaking doors, distant screams, the smell of wet asphalt from the recent rain. All of it merged into a chaotic symphony of sounds accompanying the pursuit. Jason focused on every sound, the steps of the pursued, their breathing, the rustling of their clothing. He knew any slip-up could cost him a precious second. The gangsters suddenly turned into a narrow courtyard between two buildings. Jason didn't hesitate. He sped up, jumped over the fence, and, landing on the wet ground, didn't slow his pace. The dim light of a street lamp illuminated the dirty yard, where heaps of trash and old crates created the perfect hiding place. Jason knew the enemies could be lying in wait in the shadows. Suddenly, one of the gangsters turned and fired at Jason. The bullet missed, hitting the wall, but the sound of the shot shattered the night's silence. Jason, feeling the adrenaline surge through his veins, sharply ducked behind a crate and drew a folding knife from his belt. Not an ideal weapon, but better than nothing. Soon he found himself face to face with one of the pursuers, a skinny guy with an aggressive look and fists ready for a fight. Without a word, the fight began. Jason expertly parried blows, counterattacked, and finally landed a powerful strike, sending his opponent to the ground. But in the distance there was a noise. Voices and footsteps were rapidly approaching. Jason realized the gangsters weren't alone. A minute later, another couple of figures appeared around the corner, allies of the attackers. The situation was escalating, and Jason couldn't afford to relax. He retreated to the wall of the building, using it for cover, mentally calculating every move, where he could slip through, where he could find a weapon, how to divide the opponents. His body was tense, his breathing steady, but inside he was on the edge. At the most intense moment, a bright light flashed. Mike's neighbors, who had noticed the noise, had arrived with backup. The gangsters, blinded by the sudden light and realizing the situation was slipping out of control, started to scatter. After the gangsters retreated, and the night was once again swallowed by silence, Jason took a moment to catch his breath, but didn't allow himself to relax. Every movement was precise, every sensation on the verge of focus. He knew this was only the beginning. In the dark alleys of the city, there were no coincidences. He heard a quiet step behind him. Not turning immediately, but instinctively, he sensed it wasn't an enemy. "How are you?" Mike's familiar voice came through. Jason turned. His face was impassive, but exhaustion showed in his eyes. "I'm fine," he replied, taking a deep breath. "But this isn't over. They'll be back." Mike stepped forward, his face expressing both concern and gratitude. He knew that without Jason, they wouldn't last long with the shop. But there was still one thing that troubled him. "Did you see them pull out their phones?" Mike asked. "I think they're calling for backup." Jason nodded. He had already noticed several fleeting figures in the darkness, and knew the gangsters hadn't just fled. They would set an ambush, returning with reinforcements. At that moment, as the stars over the city began to dim and their conversation turned into tense silence, several figures appeared in the dark corner of the alley. Jason and Mike turned sharply, ready for a new threat. But this time, nothing happened quickly. The tension hung in the air, and Jason was prepared for any surprise. "Hey man, are you crazy?" A voice rang out from the darkness. A figure in camouflage with a hood stepped out, holding what appeared to be an automatic weapon. Jason tensed immediately, but then he recognized the voice and realized that this wasn't an enemy, but an old ally, Liam, one of Jason's contacts from the days when he worked undercover in special services. Liam was the one who had his finger on the pulse of the city's criminal world. "Liam," Mike whispered, staring at his friend in surprise. You've been watching us?" Liam, taking his time, removed his hood and smirked. "I'm here more than you think," he replied. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice when your friends started rolling up here a few days ago?" Jason studied him. Liam was in his usual style, reserved and calm, but there was a fire of determination in his eyes. "So, you knew they'd come back," Jason said, making it clear he understood the situation. He had gotten used to working with Liam, and he knew that Liam was always one step ahead. "I've got some intel." Liam paused, checking his equipment. "You know, after your intervention, they started getting nervous. Last night, the protection for you guys was taken by some other people. Not them." Jason furrowed his brow slightly, and Mike felt a sense of unease creeping into his chest. "So, this gang isn't the end of it?" Mike asked. Liam nodded. "This is like a chess game, Mike," Liam said, his voice low but filled with certainty. "They're using pieces, but behind them stand much bigger players. You're having a small skirmish here, but these guys are just pawns. Someone at the top wants control over your workshop." The tension in the air was becoming palpable, and Jason, despite all his combat skills and experience, felt that they were facing a much more dangerous enemy. Liam pulled out a map of the district, marking a spot on the corner with a red marker. It was a strategically important area where everything had begun. "I'll send some of my people to block the streets," Liam said, knowing they couldn't afford to wait too long. "We need to find their base." At that moment, Jason felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He knew this wasn't just about extortion. This was a signal of war, a warning that they were about to face much more dangerous forces. Jason looked at Liam, who was ready to move. This guy knew how to fight, not only in the streets but in the world of espionage, battling for information and control. Liam was an old friend, someone he could count on when real help was needed. "Liam, are you sure this isn't too dangerous?" Mike asked, his voice more serious this time. Liam smiled and winked. "Oh, for you guys, I'll always be ready. But you'd better prepare yourselves. This game might be a lot more complicated than you think. We need to act fast and not give them a chance. Otherwise, we won't see any more peaceful nights." And so, just minutes later, they began their preparations. Liam sent a few of his men to block the streets, while he, armed with more powerful gear, led Jason and Mike through narrow alleyways, leaving marks for those who were coming to help. Every movement was deliberate. Jason could feel the world around them growing more dangerous, and the sense that they were on the brink of something much more serious only intensified. The lights of the cars were already visible on the horizon, but Jason knew these weren't ordinary patrols. Everything was building toward a climax, and now they had to act quickly. Liam whispered something to his men, and they disappeared into the night to flank the enemies from the other side. When the roar of an engine echoed in the distance, Jason and Mike braced themselves for the final confrontation. The darkness still cloaked the city, and the cold wind carried the smell of wet asphalt and rain-soaked walls. Jason and Mike, tightly pressed together, moved through the abandoned streets. Their steps were quiet but confident. Liam, his men, and everyone else on their team continued their work, securing their flanks. The night city seemed alive. The streets and courtyards were filled with shadows, hiding not only the traces of people, but also dangers. Jason felt the threat getting closer, something bigger than just the gangsters now focused on their path. "We can't keep ignoring this, Jason," Mike said, looking at his friend with despair in his eyes. "If they come back with reinforcements, we won't survive. We're not ready for this kind of attack." Jason, without turning from the night's shadows, nodded. He had already been formulating a plan in his head for some time, but now that they were out in the open, things had become much more complicated. He knew a conversation with Mike was necessary, but he couldn't afford to relax. The enemy was already close. "We won't wait for them, Mike," he replied, his voice calm but with an underlying strength. "We act while we still have a chance. If we stay here, we'll be sitting ducks. We need to figure out their weak points, not just hide." Jason and Mike stopped at a corner, peering down the dark alley, where the faint glow of a street lamp barely illuminated the path. Against the noisy backdrop of the city, their world seemed to shrink to that narrow space. With each step, danger grew closer, but every minute they wasted became more critical. "You're saying we need to attack?" Mike asked, his voice taut like a bowstring. He was worried about their future, about his family, and the shop that meant everything to him. "That's suicide." Jason turned to Mike, his gaze steady but tense. He knew every word he spoke could be his last. "Do you think they'll stop with us?" Jason's voice became firm but just. "Number, they're just getting started. And if we don't respond now, in a week, they'll be twice as strong. And in a month, it won't just be your business. Time is working against us." Mike stood silent, listening to Jason's words. He knew him. Jason wasn't just a friend, but someone who always led the way. But there was a moment when Mike began to doubt. Everything felt too risky. "We could just leave," he suddenly said, as if just now realizing the weight of his suggestion. "Sell everything, close the shop, and leave. Find a new city, a new place. Why not start over?" Jason looked at Mike carefully, weighing his words. He knew that for Mike, this wasn't just a business. It was a way of life, a chance to be free and independent. "You want to run?" Jason asked, his eyes hard as ice. You're willing to give up this business, this place you built? You know that running isn't the solution, Mike. It's just the start of a new nightmare." Mike sighed, his gaze growing more determined. He understood that Jason was right. Running meant losing, and if they lost, they would never feel free again. The dark corners of the city were closing in, and the night's shadow swallowed them whole. Jason and Mike stood at a crossroads. They could continue fighting despite the danger, or retreat, forget everything, and start over. Mike looked at Jason and knew the decision had already been made. "Then we do this," Mike said, his voice steady. "We fight, and if this night is our last, then we'll fight to the end." Jason nodded and gave his friend a pat on the shoulder. "I knew you'd choose the right path." They turned, heading deeper into the night, into the most dangerous corners of the city, where every shadow could hide their enemies. But now they were ready for battle, ready to protect everything they held dear. The night grew darker, but Jason wasn't afraid. Mike walked beside him, hands clenched into fists. Each step brought them closer to the climax, to the moment when their fate would be decided. In the distance, the sporadic sounds of gunshots and the hum of engines filled the air, the traces of a war they hadn't started, but one they had to join. Jason knew time wasn't waiting, and their enemies wouldn't leave them in peace. "We won't wait," Jason said, his voice resolute. "We'll find them and make sure they never threaten you or your business again." Mike nodded, understanding that their struggle was just beginning. And if they didn't win now, they would never sleep soundly again. Minutes later, they approached the abandoned warehouse marked on the map. Liam had informed them that remnants of the gang were hiding here, preparing their next attack. Jason gave a few orders to his allies, and then, with Mike, silently approached the warehouse door. He knew this wasn't just a location, it could very well be a trap set by their enemies. Tense, they froze by the door. In their eyes was everything: fear, resolve, and the weight of everything they had been through to get here. Now they had to decide whether they could win. "Are you ready?" Mike asked, staring at Jason. Jason looked him in the eyes, and in that look there was everything: pain, resolve, and belief in victory. "We're ready, and even if we don't make it out alive, we'll make them regret ever starting with us." Jason quietly pressed the door, and it creaked open. Soon they were inside. As Jason and Mike entered the warehouse, the air was thick, as if time had frozen, and each step echoed in the empty space. Dust hung in the air, and the gray walls, scarred by bullet holes and old graffiti, seemed like dead witnesses to countless battles. "Listen, Mike. Stay alert," Jason whispered, feeling every muscle tense. He knew that such places always concealed not only physical traps, but psychological ones. It's not just what you see, but what you don't notice. His mind raced again with thoughts of how dangerous this situation was. It wasn't just the gangsters. Jason had long realized that behind all this extortion was a much more powerful organization, and tonight could be the beginning of a far more terrifying war. The silence around them was deafening, but within it there was still some rustling sound. Suddenly, footsteps could be heard, fast, with a characteristic rhythm that spoke of well-prepared men. Jason stopped and signaled Mike with a gesture. They froze, hiding in the shadows of old crates and parts scattered around the warehouse. The wind outside was picking up, creating the illusion of life in this empty, dead space. It was the last shadow standing between them and what could be their end. Jason knew that everything that happened next depended on them, their speed, their resolve, and their ability not to panic. In the next moment, they would face what they had long been trying to avoid. The light from a small window barely illuminated the figures approaching the warehouse. Jason and Mike didn't have to wait long before their opponents emerged from the shadows. These were the same gangsters who had threatened them on the street, but now they were reinforced. Each of them was armed, with rifles, pistols. Their appearance had changed. They were no longer just street extortionists. They now looked like seasoned fighters. "You won't stop us," said one of the gangsters, their leader, with a sneer. "This is all going to end badly for you." Mike, clenching his fists, wanted to say something, but Jason stopped him with a gesture. He knew that right now saying too much would be a mistake. There was too much truth in their words. This gang had support from higher up, and they wouldn't stop until their target was destroyed. Jason stepped forward, his breathing steady and cold. "Don't think I came here just for the hell of it," he replied, quietly, but with iron confidence in his voice. "You've got one chance to leave. Don't waste it." The shadows passed by, but they hadn't disappeared. In the eyes of each of them, Jason saw determination. But something had changed, as if this threat was more personal to them than just a simple skirmish. As soon as the gang leader raised his hand to give the command, Jason was already in motion. He was as fast as lightning. With a swift movement, he leapt toward the first attacker, knocking the pistol out of his hands. The second wave, the gangsters rushed toward him, but Jason was quicker. He used the surrounding space, moving from one shadow to another like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment. The strikes were precise and unerring, each gangster hitting the ground before they even realized what had happened. Mike, without hesitation, jumped in beside him and joined the fight. He hadn't been in such situations for a while, but with every passing moment, he felt his fear fade. Now they were not just friends but partners, fighting for their freedom and lives. Each strike was emotionally charged, not just defense but revenge for all the years of fear and oppression they had endured. With each step, Jason felt the battle with the gangsters transform into a fight against the system itself. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just an isolated clash. They were facing something far more dangerous than mere street extortionists. This was a real criminal network, with people of great influence involved. The gang leader, noticing that his men were losing ground, tried to retreat. He knew his plans were crumbling, but Jason wasn't ready to let them go. "You're not leaving," he said, grabbing him by the shoulder and turning him to face him. The leader froze, his face twisted not so much in pain, but in the realization that it was all lost. He was prepared for resistance, but not for such quick, decisive actions. Jason spoke again, his voice cold and direct, like a weapon. "You have one chance, to talk or leave here alive." The gang leader slowly lowered his gaze, realizing that he had lost this battle. His last hope had crumbled. The one he had thought weak had turned out to be stronger. He looked at his people, realizing that there was no point in returning here anymore. They were already defeated. Mike approached Jason and, looking him in the eyes, said, "You're right. They'll be back. But now they know we're not to be messed with. We won't just sit idly by. This is only the beginning." Jason nodded, his gaze confident and resolute. "We'll be ready. No shadows can hide those who are willing to fight to the end." When it seemed everything was settled and their enemies began to retreat, unexpectedly, another figure emerged from the shadows. Jason and Mike immediately tensed. This was the one who had been behind it all. This was their true enemy. "Now you understand that the real fight begins," the man said, his voice low and confident. Liam stood in the shadows, watching the scene unfold, his eyes fixed on Jason and Mike's group. He knew they couldn't hold out for long without help, and his time had come. Despite all his secrecy, Liam had always been one step ahead. Everything happening in this criminal world, he had been controlling it for a long time. The man who had just appeared in front of them, the main enemy, the one behind the entire network, was merely a pawn in a much larger game. As if sensing the end was near, he approached Jason and Mike. This was the moment of truth. Their eyes met, and in them, there was resolve. "You don't understand," the enemy said, his voice cold and assured. "You don't even realize who you're up against. This is not a game. This is war." Jason stepped forward and calmly replied, "If this is war, then we'll fight," Jason said. And in that decisive moment, when it seemed like the situation was spiraling out of control, Liam and his team emerged from the shadows. With lightning speed and incredible precision, they surrounded the enemies, capturing them and leaving no chance for retreat. Liam wasn't the kind of person who relied solely on force. His team operated with the precision of special forces. Everything happened quickly, like a well-choreographed film. Each enemy was disarmed and captured with minimal loss to the Allies. Liam, with his usual calm and confident smile, stopped right in front of the main enemy, who now seemed to realize that his chances of winning had vanished. "You thought you could manipulate this world?" Liam asked, studying him. "You were just a pawn who didn't notice when you were set up in a trap." The enemy tried to resist, but in his eyes now there was no certainty, only confusion. He knew that in this game he had gotten into, there would be no winners. Liam stepped closer, his team already having the rest of the enemies in their sights. This was the end of the game, and Liam knew that this war would end today. "It's over," Liam said, his voice firm and resolute. "You thought controlling the world was easy, but all you did was create an enemy who was standing on your shoulders." The main enemy tried to take a step back, but Liam immediately signaled his men to act. In the next moment, all his accomplices were neutralized and surrounded. Mike and Jason stood nearby, watching as their enemies, who only moments ago had threatened them, were now disarmed and defenseless. In their eyes there was no fear anymore, only calm and a sense of quiet satisfaction. Mike looked at Jason. "Did you know Liam was controlling everything?" he asked. Jason nodded, smiling. "I knew. He was our last trump card, and I knew Liam would never let us down." Liam approached them and, without wasting any time, extended his hand. "Glad I could help," he said. "I always keep my finger on the pulse. Now it's all over." No matter how dark the night had been, with the dawn on the horizon came a new beginning. Jason and Mike stood in the midst of the desolate warehouse, feeling how the world around them had changed. The shadows that had tormented them for days had finally disappeared, and in their place was not only peace but a new reality in which they were the victors. "We didn't just save the shop," Mike said, gazing at the rising sun. "We saved our lives." Jason agreed. "But it's not about what we saved," he said. "It's about knowing how to fight now, and knowing there is no force that can break us." Soon the police arrived, but the operation was already over. Liam and his team had vanished into the shadows, leaving Jason and Mike with what they had fought so hard to protect. And though the city had yet to learn what had happened that night, they knew. Their world had changed, and they had become part of it. Mike turned and looked at Jason. His friend was there, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. "Well," Mike said with a smile, "when are you going to get back to fixing things?" Jason laughed. "I think we should take a little break, but soon I'll get back to work. This shop will run, and we'll keep fighting for what matters." And though the day had been filled with danger and pain, they understood that now they stood at the threshold of a new, better beginning.